If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. Let's continue. Morning slowly dawned over the elegant buildings of the Kensington district in London. From those wide windows, it was possible to see the green canopies of ancient trees, the discreet movement of imported cars, and the organized routine of one of the city's most noble addresses. The September sun streamed through the tempered glass, drawing golden streaks across the travertine marble floor. On the 12th floor of an imposing residential building, the Smith family's apartment awoke to the usual sound of the alarm clock at 6:15 in the morning. Robert Smith got up, his body still heavy with fatigue. At 43, he was a well-groomed man, with greying hair at his temples and a generally focused gaze. He wore discreet framed glasses and kept his beard always neatly trimmed, a reflection of a discipline he had learned from a young age. He worked as the financial director of a French multinational in the pharmaceutical sector, a position he had achieved after years of intense dedication. He carried on his shoulders the responsibility of supporting his family alone, since his wife had left 2 years prior. There had been no death, no definitive tragedy, just a silent separation that had left deep marks on everyone. Mary had decided to restart her life in Canada, claiming she could no longer bear the intense routine of London, the emotional distance that had settled between them, and most importantly, the difficulty of dealing with one of their children's special needs after the accident. Robert never judged her publicly, but privately, he felt a mix of resentment and incomprehension. How could someone simply leave, abandoning 2 children who needed her so much? This question accompanied him every morning as he drank his coffee alone, looking out the kitchen window. Mary had been, for years, a vibrant woman full of plans. She worked as an architect and dreamed of having her own office. But something changed in her after the twins' birth. Motherhood, which she had imagined as a transformative and wonderful experience, proved exhausting and challenging. The babies cried a lot, slept little, and Mary felt increasingly overwhelmed. Robert, absorbed by work, didn't notice in time how much she was sinking into a sadness that went beyond physical exhaustion. When he finally did, it was already too late. The chasm between them had become insurmountable. Peter's accident was the final blow. Mary, who was already struggling internally with feelings of inadequacy and guilt, couldn't cope with the idea of having a child who would need special care indefinitely. She blamed herself for the accident, though she had no direct responsibility. She thought she should have been more attentive, should have prevented the boy from running that way. Robert tried to convince her that it was no one's fault that accidents happen, but Mary had already made her decision. 3 months after Peter's last surgery, she packed her bags and left. The twins, Peter and Clara, were now 9 years old. Previously inseparable and full of energy, they had become quieter, more withdrawn children, especially after Peter suffered the accident that changed everything. It was on a July weekend during a trip to the family's beach house in Brighton. The day was beautiful, with strong sun and a calm sea. Peter and Clara were playing in the sand, building castles and running after the waves. Robert and Mary were lying under the umbrella, enjoying a rare afternoon of joint rest. It all happened very quickly. Peter saw a colourful ball someone had forgotten near the rocks and ran to get it. The sand was uneven in that part of the beach, full of holes and rocks covered by algae. The boy stumbled and fell awkwardly, his foot caught between 2 rocks. His scream echoed across the entire beach. Robert ran desperately, finding his son with his face contorted in pain and his leg in an abnormal position. The ambulance took over 40 minutes to arrive. Those were the longest hours of Robert's life. The diagnosis was devastating. Peter had fractured his tibia and fibula, in addition to rupturing important knee ligaments. He needed 2 complex surgeries, one to fix the bones with metal plates and another to reconstruct the ligaments. The doctors explained that recovery would be long, that the boy would have motor sequelae and would need intense physical therapy for at least 2 years. There was a real chance that he might never run as before, play sports, or have the same mobility as other children. Peter faced everything with a courage that impressed the doctors. He cried from pain during physical therapy sessions, but never gave up. He tried to walk, even when each step felt like torture. He used crutches and needed help to climb stairs, get into the car, even to bathe. Robert watched his son fight every day and felt his heart break. Mary, for her part, couldn't watch. Every time she saw Peter with crutches, every time the boy groaned in pain, she felt an overwhelming guilt that consumed her from within. Clara, in turn, reacted to her brother's accident with a silence that deeply worried everyone. Previously talkative and cheerful, always the first to tell invented stories about princesses and dragons, she began to accompany Peter with an almost maternal protective gaze, as if she felt she needed to compensate for her mother's absence. She put aside her favorite dolls, her colorful drawings, her make-believe games. Now she spent hours sitting beside her brother, holding his hand during physical therapy sessions, helping him reach objects he couldn't get alone, sharing her school snacks with him. Robert noticed these changes, but attributed everything to the grief of the separation and the trauma of the accident. He himself had not yet fully processed the new family configuration. He sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, looking for Mary beside him, and it took a few seconds to remember she wasn't there anymore. He felt guilty for not having noticed in time what was happening to his wife, guilty for not having been able to stop her from leaving, guilty for leaving his children without a mother. He tried to compensate with his presence whenever possible. He took the twins to the cinema on weekends, prepared breakfast on Saturdays, and helped with homework every night. But work was relentless. Meetings that extended late, frequent business trips, reports that needed urgent delivery. Robert was torn between being a good father and a good professional, and he felt he was failing in both roles. It was in this fragile scenario that Patricia Miller appeared. She entered Robert's life unexpectedly at a business meeting organized by a partner company in a luxury hotel on Oxford Street. It was late March, a hot and humid afternoon typical of London. The meeting concerned a complex corporate merger, and the presence of lawyers was essential. Patricia was one of the partners in the firm hired for legal advice. She entered the meeting room with a striking presence. At 38, Patricia had a classic and cultivated beauty. Dark hair always impeccable, pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore a perfectly tailored grey suit, discreet high heels, and an Italian leather briefcase. She spoke with confidence, cited jurisprudence from memory, and mastered every detail of the contracts. Robert was impressed by her intelligence, the way she argued, her ability to anticipate problems and propose solutions. They spoke briefly after the meeting. Patricia commented on the complexity of the case. Robert thanked her. She smiled professionally but warmly. They exchanged cards. Robert kept hers in his wallet. Patricia called a week later. She said she was reviewing points of the contract and would like to clarify some doubts. They arranged for coffee in Canary Wharf on a Thursday late afternoon. The meeting was pleasant. Patricia clarified the doubts in 15 minutes, but the conversation extended for more than 2 hours. They talked about work, about the pressures of corporate life. Robert, who hadn't had such a relaxed conversation in months, felt good. Patricia knew how to listen, ask the right questions. When he mentioned he was separated and had 2 children, she didn't recoil. She said she found his dedication admirable. The meetings became more frequent. Dinners in Notting Hill restaurants, long conversations. Patricia talked about her brief and failed marriage, about how she had dedicated her life to her career. She mentioned that she loved children, that she had nieces and nephews she adored visiting. Robert listened to this as a balm for his wounds. He felt seen, understood, valued. It was 6 months before he decided to introduce her to the twins. He spoke with a therapist who was helping him cope with the separation. She suggested he observe how the children reacted and not to force anything. Robert agreed and planned everything carefully. It was on a Saturday afternoon at the apartment. Yvonne, the housekeeper who had worked there for over 10 years, prepared a special lunch. Robert wanted everything to be perfect and asked her to make the children's favorite dish, chicken parmigiana with rice and fries. Yvonne agreed, but something about the request made her apprehensive. She couldn't explain exactly what it was, just an uncomfortable feeling that this could change everything. Yvonne Jones was 56 years old and originally from a small town in rural Cornwall called St. Ives. She had come to London at 20, fleeing poverty and seeking a better life. She started working in family homes, living in, accepting low wages. Over time, she built a reputation as a dedicated and honest worker. When she met the Smiths, the twins were babies, and Mary was exhausted, needing urgent help. Yvonne started working there Monday to Saturday, arriving at 7 in the morning and leaving at 5 in the afternoon. She took care of the house, prepared meals, organized the routine. But she did much more than that. When Mary couldn't calm the babies, Yvonne rocked them, singing Cornish lullabies until they fell asleep. When Robert came home late from work, she left dinner ready and warm. As the children grew, she taught them to tie their shoes, brush their teeth properly, and put away their toys. It was Yvonne who took the twins to the park in the late afternoons, who invented stories to make them eat vegetables, who healed scraped knees and wiped away tears after childish quarrels. Mary had always been grateful for the help, but maintained a certain emotional distance, as if afraid of becoming too dependent. Robert in turn trusted Yvonne completely, but rarely showed it in words. It was as if her presence was as natural as the air they breathed, something essential but invisible. After Mary left, Yvonne became even more fundamental. It was she who explained to the twins, as gently as possible, that their mother had traveled and would be away for a while. It was she who comforted Clara when the girl cried every night asking for her mother. It was she who stayed by Peter's side during the first physical therapy sessions, holding his hand as he screamed in pain. It was she who kept the house running while Robert tried not to completely collapse. Now preparing that special lunch, Yvonne felt a tension she couldn't explain. She had known Robert for so many years that she could read his expressions. She saw that he was hopeful, even excited. But she also saw that he was fragile, vulnerable, desperately needing to believe that everything would work out. This worried her. Vulnerable men often don't see what's right in front of their eyes. Patricia arrived punctually, as always. She brought a bouquet of white flowers for Yvonne, a gesture the housekeeper found strange. No one ever gave her flowers. She thanked her with a restrained smile, and placed them in a vase. Patricia also brought gifts for the children, a modern board game for Clara, and an illustrated book about Paralympic athletes for Peter. They were expensive, well-chosen gifts, but Yvonne noticed they were impersonal, as if ordered online without much thought. Lunch was cordial, superficially pleasant. Patricia sat at the table with impeccable posture, asked polite questions about school, about their favorite subjects, about their games. The children responded shyly but without hostility. Clara was quiet most of the time, picking at her food with a fork. Peter tried to be friendly, talked about the adapted swimming lessons he had started taking. Patricia listened with apparent attention, smiled at the right moments, and made encouraging comments. Robert felt relieved, almost euphoric. He saw it as a sign that things could work, that it might indeed be possible to rebuild a balanced and welcoming home. He looked at Patricia with gratitude and admiration. She seemed so natural, so at ease, so genuinely interested in the children. He thought, for the first time in a long time, that he might be happy again. Yvonne, however, picked up on something different. She served the food, collected the plates, circulated through the dining room, observing everything with her trained attention. She noticed how Patricia looked at the children. There was something in her eyes that didn't match her smile, a cold, calculating glint, as if she were evaluating, measuring, planning. When Peter accidentally knocked over a glass of juice, Yvonne saw a flash of irritation cross Patricia's face before she recomposed herself and said in a sweet voice that it was no problem. It was just an accident. But Yvonne knew expressions. She knew the difference between a genuinely compassionate person and someone who merely plays the part. Patricia's irritation was real, visceral, even if it lasted only a fraction of a second. The smile that followed was mechanical, rehearsed. There was also the matter of how Patricia reacted when Clara mentioned her mother. The girl, with that childlike innocence that had not yet learned to filter emotions, said that her mother called every Sunday from Canada and that she missed her. Patricia maintained her smile, but Yvonne saw her eyes narrow slightly, as if that information bothered her. As if Mary's existence, even from a distance, was a threat to be considered. In the following months, Patricia became an increasingly constant presence. Robert, enchanted and hopeful, began to include her in daily decisions. She offered opinions on which school would be best for the children the following year, suggested changes to Peter's physical therapy schedule, claiming the current ones were inefficient, questioned the diet Robert maintained for the twins, saying they needed more dietary discipline. Gradually, she started bringing her things to the apartment. First, it was clothes for the weekend, then personal hygiene products, then books and decorative objects. Robert saw this as a natural sign of commitment, of a relationship evolving into something more serious. He liked coming home and finding her there, preparing something in the kitchen or reading on the living room sofa. He felt less alone, less overwhelmed. Patricia had an efficient way of organizing things, solving practical problems, and keeping everything under control. It was precisely what he thought he needed. Yvonne, however, saw it differently. She saw Patricia taking over the territory, establishing dominance, marking her presence. And, more disturbingly, she saw the children gradually changing. The transformation was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Peter, who had been progressing well in physical therapy and had even managed to walk a few steps without crutches, began to show resistance to going to sessions. He complained of pains he hadn't mentioned so frequently before, cried before leaving the house, and invented elaborate excuses. Clara, in turn, became increasingly withdrawn. She stopped asking to invite school friends to play at the apartment, something she often did before. She stopped watching the cartoons she loved, stopped drawing and painting, activities that always calmed her. She spent hours locked in her room, lying on her bed staring at the ceiling. When Yvonne asked if everything was all right, she just shook her head and said yes, but her eyes told another story. Robert attributed these changes to the natural jealousy of children who saw their father getting involved with someone else. Patricia skillfully reinforced this interpretation. She said it was completely normal, that she had read about it, that they just needed time and patience to adapt. She appeared understanding, patient, willing to wait as long as necessary. Robert believed her because he wanted to believe, because he needed to believe that everything would work out. Yvonne, however, began to notice other details that deeply disturbed her. The children, who had always been good eaters, began to systematically refuse food. Peter, who was already naturally thin, began to lose weight visibly and worryingly. The clothes Yvonne had bought just 3 months earlier were already loose on him. His cheeks lost their childish roundness. His arms became thin. His eyes began to seem too large for his face. Clara also lost weight, though less dramatically. During meals, when Robert was present, the children ate a little, forced. But Yvonne noticed that they seemed afraid to eat, looking nervously at Patricia before each mouthful, as if asking for silent permission. And Patricia, with a sweet smile, always said things like, "You should eat slowly. You don't need to stuff yourselves. It's better to eat less and with quality." Phrases that seemed reasonable on the surface, but which Yvonne interpreted as something more sinister. When Robert was not home, the atmosphere changed completely. Yvonne noticed this with increasing clarity. The children became tense, silent, as if constantly on alert. They avoided making noise, moved around the house with excessive care, spoke in whispers. It was as if they were walking on eggshells, fearing breaking something invisible and suffering unknown consequences. One October morning, Robert left earlier than usual for an important meeting with European investors. Patricia, who now spent 3 or 4 nights a week at the apartment, was responsible for getting the children ready for school. Yvonne was in the laundry room folding clothes when she heard a muffled sound coming from the second floor. She quickly went up and found Peter sitting on the hallway floor, holding his leg with an expression of genuine pain. Patricia was standing beside him, arms crossed, looking down with an expression Yvonne would never forget. There was no compassion in that look. There was impatience, irritation, almost contempt. Patricia was saying, in a cutting tone very different from the sweet voice she used in front of Robert, that the boy was inventing an excuse not to go to school, that she was tired of that act, that he needed to stop playing the victim. Peter cried softly, trying to explain that the pain was real, that his leg had locked up again as it sometimes did, but Patricia didn't want to listen. Yvonne intervened for the first time directly and firmly. She said in a calm but determined voice that the boy was indeed in pain, that this sometimes happened because of the surgery, and that it might be better to take him to the orthopedist. Patricia turned to her with a look that seemed capable of piercing steel. She replied in a cold and precise tone that Yvonne had no children, didn't understand parenting, didn't know how to differentiate real whining from childish manipulation, and that she should go back to her household chores and leave educational matters to those who understood them. The housekeeper felt her blood boil, but she controlled herself with all the self-control she could muster. She knew with the painful clarity of someone who had lived her entire life in a subordinate position that any direct confrontation could cost her job. And without her there, the children would be completely unprotected, entirely exposed to that woman whose true nature only she seemed to perceive. That night, when Robert finally returned home after 11, Yvonne was waiting in the kitchen. She had prepared the chamomile tea he liked to drink before bed, a routine they had kept for years. Robert entered tired, his tie loosened, his executive briefcase heavy in his hand. He thanked her for the tea and sat at the kitchen table, massaging his temples. Yvonne took a deep breath and began carefully. She said she was worried about the children, that they seemed different, quieter, more scared. She mentioned Peter's weight loss, Clara's dark circles under her eyes, their growing resistance to going to school. She suggested, with all the delicacy she could muster, that it might be good to have a more complete evaluation, talk to a child psychologist, and check if everything was really all right. Robert listened, but she saw that her words weren't really penetrating. He was too tired, too distracted, and perhaps deep down he didn't want to hear. He thanked her for her concern with a tired smile, said he would talk to the children over the weekend, but that it was probably just a difficult phase of adaptation. Children are like that, he said. They test limits, they manipulate emotionally. Patricia had explained all this to him. Yvonne felt her heart sink. That woman not only controlled the children, but also controlled the narrative, controlled Robert's perception of what was happening. It was a brilliant and terrifying strategy. Patricia, who was upstairs supposedly taking a shower, had overheard much of the conversation. She came down shortly after, wearing an elegant bathrobe, her hair still damp. With a sweet and worried smile, she placed a hand on Robert's shoulder and said that Yvonne was too dedicated a housekeeper, that she worried excessively, that she saw problems where none existed. She said she understood, that it was natural for someone who had cared for the children since they were babies to have difficulty accepting changes, but that it was important not to confuse zeal with overprotection. Robert agreed, relieved to have that comforting explanation. Yvonne watched the scene with a mixture of growing frustration and fear. She saw how Patricia manipulated the situation masterfully, how she transformed every legitimate concern into an exaggeration by a possessive employee. That night, Yvonne barely slept in the small room she occupied in the back of the apartment. She kept thinking about the children, imagining what might be happening when she wasn't around, when no one was watching. She began to understand that she would need more than words. She would need concrete, irrefutable evidence that not even Robert could ignore or rationalize. She decided she would start observing even more closely, documenting every strange detail, every change in the children's behavior. She picked up an old notebook she kept in a drawer and started writing. Date, time, what she observed, what she heard. It was risky to keep it, but it was necessary. She also started talking more with the children whenever she had the opportunity, always subtly so as not to raise suspicions. She asked how they had slept, if they were hungry, if there was anything they wanted to tell her. Peter and Clara, however, remained cautiously silent, as if they knew any wrong word could have consequences. The following days were tense. The situation in the apartment seemed to be heading towards a breaking point. Robert immersed himself even deeper in work, using long hours at the office as an escape from dealing with the complexities of domestic life. Patricia took advantage of his increasing absence to establish increasingly rigid rules for the children. Inflexible schedules for everything, waking up, eating, studying, playing, sleeping. Any deviation was met with cutting criticism. Yvonne noticed everything, wrote everything down, but felt powerless. It was like watching an accident in slow motion, knowing that something terrible was about to happen, but having no strength to stop it. It was on a Thursday afternoon that the situation took a definitive leap towards the precipice. Robert had to travel for work to Edinburgh. He had important meetings with foreign investors that could not be postponed. He would be away for 3 full days. Patricia immediately offered to stay at the apartment to care for the children during his absence. Robert accepted without hesitation, even thinking that this would further strengthen the bond between her and the twins. When Yvonne learned of the trip, she felt such a strong tightening in her chest that she had to sit down. She knew those 3 days would be critical. She knew that without Robert around, even if he was a distracted observer, things could get significantly worse. She thought about asking to work extended hours, about sleeping in the apartment those days, but she knew Patricia would never allow it. On the first night without Robert, Yvonne noticed that Patricia locked the children in their rooms earlier than usual. It was only 8 in the evening when she heard the click of the doors being closed from the outside. She quickly went upstairs and found Patricia in the hallway, putting the keys in her blazer pocket. She questioned what was happening. Patricia coldly replied that the children needed to learn to sleep alone, without pampering, without anyone rushing to attend to them every time they whimpered. She said that this was modern education, based on proven methods of child autonomy. Yvonne tried to argue that Peter often woke up in pain during the night, that Clara had frequent nightmares, that locking the doors from the outside was dangerous in case of emergency. Patricia looked at her with the same icy contempt as before, and was even more direct. She said that if Yvonne interfered one more time, she would be fired immediately, that she had no power there, no right to question educational decisions, that Robert trusted her, Patricia, completely and would never believe the word of a housekeeper against hers. The words were spoken with calculated cruelty, each syllable chosen to hurt and intimidate. Yvonne felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The threat was real, and she knew it. Without a job, without references, at 56, it would be almost impossible to start over. But worse than losing her job would be abandoning those children. She decided she would need to be smarter, more careful. She backed down, apologized in a low voice, and went back down to the kitchen. She spent the entire night awake, sitting in the kitchen chair, alert to any sound coming from the bedrooms. She heard Peter cry softly for almost an hour, a muffled, desperate cry that broke her heart. She thought 1,000 times about going up, about breaking down the door if necessary, but she knew that would only make everything worse. Patricia was testing limits, establishing territory, showing who was in charge. In the morning, when she finally managed to see the children before they left, for school, what she saw deeply shocked her. Peter was pale, his eyes red and swollen from crying so much. He had dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept at all. Clara was equally dejected, her face closed off, her movements slow. Neither of them wanted to eat breakfast, even though Yvonne had prepared the pancakes they loved. It was at that moment that Yvonne made her definitive decision. No matter the risk, no matter the personal consequences, she needed to gather concrete evidence of what was happening. She picked up the old cell phone she kept and checked if the camera worked. It did. She decided that if she had the opportunity, she would record something she could show Robert, the school, the authorities, whoever was necessary. Over the next few days, the tension grew like a brewing storm. Patricia exercised increasingly absolute control. She defined every detail of the children's routine, from what they ate to what they wore, from how long they could spend in the bathroom to the tone of voice they should use when speaking. Yvonne observed everything with a broken heart, mentally noting every abuse, every veiled cruelty. On the last night before Robert's return, something happened that definitively sealed Yvonne's resolve. She was organizing the pantry when she heard a dull thud coming from upstairs, followed by a muffled groan of pain. She dropped everything and rushed upstairs, her heart pounding. What she found in the second-floor hallway would be etched in her memory forever. Peter was lying on the marble floor, trying to get up alone with an expression of pain and despair. His crutch had fallen a few feet ahead, out of his reach. Patricia was standing beside him, arms crossed, observing with chilling indifference. There was no compassion, No concern, just a calculated coldness that made the scene seem even more terrible. She said in a slow, clear voice that he needed to learn to fend for himself, that he wouldn't always have someone to help him, that he needed to stop playing the victim and using the accident as an excuse for attention. Peter cried, trying to explain that his leg had locked up, that he couldn't support himself, but his words were lost in sobs. Yvonne could no longer contain herself. All the anger, all the frustration, all the horror of what she had been. Witnessing exploded. She ran to the boy, helped him up carefully, picked up his crutch, took him back to his room, and laid him on the bed. She covered him, wiped his tears. Then she turned to Patricia. She looked directly into that woman's eyes and said, without any submission in her voice, that this was not right, that the children were suffering, that she needed to stop. Patricia smiled, an icy smile, and replied that Yvonne had no power there, that Robert trusted her completely and would never believe any accusation coming from a housekeeper. And then she added, with a coldness that chilled Yvonne's blood, "If you try to harm me, I will make sure you never get a job anywhere again. I will say you steal, that you mistreat the children. I have contacts, I have influence. You are nothing." Yvonne understood she was dealing with someone far more dangerous than she had imagined, but she also understood that she needed to act whatever the cost, because those children had no one else. That night, she made her final decision. In the morning, as soon as Robert returned, she would do whatever was necessary to protect Peter and Clara. It didn't matter if she lost her job. She knew what she was seeing. She knew what was happening inside that elegant house, and she could no longer remain silent. The sun rose over London, bringing with it the promise of change. Robert would return that morning, and Yvonne, with a heavy heart but unwavering determination, knew she would need to find a way to make him see the truth. The children needed him. They needed him to wake up, to look with real attention, to perceive the terror growing within their own home. She didn't have a perfect plan, but she had something more important, the absolute certainty that she would not fail, because ultimately those two children had no one else but her to protect them. And Yvonne, a humble 56-year-old housekeeper, would be the warrior they needed, even if it cost everything. The taxi stopped in front of the building at 10 in the morning on a grey Friday. Robert got out with his executive bag and leather briefcase, tired but relieved to be back. The meetings in Edinburgh had been intense and productive. The investors had shown real interest in the project, but none of that mattered as much as being home again with his children. He had missed them in a way that surprised him, a physical longing that tightened his chest. He went up in the elevator, thinking about how good it would be to hug them, hear their voices, check if they were well. He also thought of Patricia, how generous she had been in taking care of the children during his absence. That meant a lot to him. It was a clear sign of commitment, that she truly cared about the family he was trying to rebuild. When he opened, the apartment door silence greeted him. It was a dense, heavy, different silence. Usually when he came home he heard sounds of life, the television on, the children talking, Yvonne moving around the kitchen. But at that moment, there was only a sonic void that made him slightly uncomfortable. Yvonne appeared almost immediately from the kitchen hallway. Robert noticed that she looked exhausted, with deep dark circles under her eyes and a tense expression he had never seen before. She greeted him in a low, almost whispered voice and took his suitcase, offering to carry it to the bedroom. But before Robert could ask where the children were, Patricia came down the stairs. She was impeccable as always, wearing black tailored trousers and a white silk blouse. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant ponytail, her makeup discreet but perfect. She smiled when she saw him and walked towards him with that natural confidence that so attracted him. They hugged, and she commented that he looked tired, that the trip must have been exhausting, and that she had prepared fresh coffee for him. Robert asked about the twins. Patricia explained in a calm and controlled tone that they were in their rooms doing their schoolwork. She said she had established a more disciplined routine during those days, that the children needed to learn to have fixed schedules for studies and responsibilities. Robert found this reasonable, even positive. He had always worried about the lack of discipline, about being too permissive because of the guilt he felt. He went upstairs, wanting to see his children, hug them, make up for lost time. He knocked on Peter's bedroom door and entered. The boy was sitting at his desk chair, hunched over a math notebook. When he heard the door open and saw his father, his eyes instantly filled with tears. It was such an intense and unexpected reaction that Robert felt his heart clench. Peter got up with difficulty, leaning on the desk, and walked towards him with outstretched arms. Robert hugged him and felt how thin his son's body was, his bones more prominent, his weight lighter than he remembered. The boy clung to him with desperate strength, as if afraid he would leave again. He cried softly, wetting his father's shirt with silent tears. Robert was confused and worried. He asked what had happened, if he was okay, if he was in pain. Peter hesitated, looked at the door as if checking if someone was listening, and just said that he had missed him very much, that he didn't want his father to travel again, that he wanted to stay close to him. The intensity of those words was disproportionate to the time he had been away. It had only been 3 days, but Peter reacted as if it had been months. He then went to Clara's room. She was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, with a closed book beside her. When Robert entered, the girl quickly sat up and also started crying. She ran to him and threw herself into his arms, with a need that was painful to see. Robert lifted her off the floor, even though she was already too big for it, and again felt how much lighter, more fragile she was. Clara repeated between sobs that she missed him, that she wanted him to stay home, that she didn't want Patricia there anymore. This last sentence made Robert stop. He asked why she said that, if Patricia had done something to bother her. Clara immediately fell silent, as if she had said something forbidden. She quickly shook her head and mumbled no, that everything was fine, that it was just missing him. But Robert saw something in his daughter's eyes that disturbed him. It was fear, a real and deep fear that didn't match the situation. He felt that something was wrong, something the children weren't saying, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. He thought that perhaps it was just insecurity, fear of abandonment because of their mother's departure. He decided he would spend more time with them in the coming days, that he would talk calmly to understand what was happening. He went down to the kitchen where Patricia and Yvonne were. The tension between the two women was palpable, though neither said anything. Patricia prepared coffee with efficient movements, and Yvonne cleaned the sink with more force than necessary. Robert commented that the children seemed different, more sensitive. Patricia was quick to explain. She said that they had deeply felt his absence, that during the 3 days they had cried a lot asking for their father, that she had done her best to comfort them but obviously couldn't replace him. She also said that they had tested limits, tried to manipulate emotionally, but that she had maintained the necessary firmness because she knew children needed structure. Robert listened and found it all coherent, even admirable. Yvonne, washing dishes with her back turned, felt frustration grow like a suffocating wave. She wanted to scream the truth, wanted to shake Robert and make him see what was happening right under his nose. But she knew Patricia had perfectly prepared the ground, had built a narrative that made sense, that fit the concerns and guilt Robert already carried. That afternoon, after Patricia left, claiming work commitments, Yvonne finally managed to be alone with Robert. He was in his office reviewing emails when she knocked on the door and asked permission to speak. She said it was important, that she needed a few minutes of his attention. Robert, seeing the seriousness on the housekeeper's face, put down his phone and gestured for her to sit. Yvonne took a deep breath and began. She chose each word carefully, trying not to sound accusatory or exaggerated. She said the children were not well, that something was happening that he needed to see. She mentioned Peter's alarming weight loss, Clara's withdrawn behavior, the constant fear. Both showed. She spoke about how the children had changed since Patricia started spending more time in the apartment, how they had stopped eating properly, how they always seemed tense and scared. She said that during those 3 days he was away, things had significantly worsened, that the children were locked in their rooms at night, that they cried for hours without comfort, that she herself had been threatened with dismissal when she tried to intervene. Robert listened with an increasingly closed expression. Yvonne saw defensiveness grow in him, saw how her words were filtered through the lens of distrust and denial. When she finished, he remained silent for a few seconds that felt eternal, Then, in a tired and slightly irritated voice, Robert said he understood her concern, but he thought she was exaggerating. He said that Patricia was a respected professional, a person of integrity whom he had known for almost a year, that she had been extremely generous in caring for the children during his absence, that it was natural for there to be a period of adaptation, that children always tested limits with new people. Regarding locking the bedroom doors, he said that perhaps Patricia had exaggerated a little with discipline, but that there was certainly no ill intention, that he himself sometimes felt lost in how to raise his children without their mother's presence, that different people had different methods. About the weight loss, he said he would schedule medical appointments to check, but that it could just be a growth phase or a consequence of emotional stress from the separation. Yvonne felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. She tried to argue more, tried to make him see, but Robert had already decided. He thanked her for her concern, said he appreciated how much she cared for the children, but asked her to try to give Patricia a chance not to create unnecessary conflicts. He said that perhaps Yvonne was feeling jealous, not consciously, but because she had always been the central female figure in that house, and now another woman was occupying that space. Those words were like a slap. Yvonne left the office with her eyes burning with suppressed tears and the painful certainty that her words were not enough. She needed more concrete evidence, irrefutable proof that even Robert could not ignore or rationalize. In the following days, the apartment's dynamic settled into a fragile and tense balance. Robert returned to his intense work routine, leaving early and returning late. Patricia began staying in the apartment 4 nights a week, increasingly integrated into the family routine. Yvonne continued her work, but now with obsessive attention to every detail, every interaction between Patricia and the children. She began documenting everything in a small notebook she hid at the bottom of her clothes drawer in her room. She noted dates, times, what she observed, what she heard. Peter completely refused lunch on Monday. Clara cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes on Tuesday. Patricia yelled at Peter on Wednesday because he spilled water on the floor. The children were sent to their rooms without dinner on Thursday, accused of having spoken back. Yvonne also began to pay special attention to the school. Every morning she took the children to the gate and spoke briefly with their main teacher, Mrs. Marcia Green. Marcia was 52, an experienced educator, and knew Peter and Clara since they started school 3 years earlier. She had always been attentive and dedicated, the kind of educator who truly cared about the students' well-being beyond academic performance. One rainy November morning, Marcia called Yvonne aside before she left. She said she needed to talk about Peter. She explained that the boy, who had always been a participatory student despite his physical limitations, was becoming increasingly withdrawn. He no longer raised his hand to answer questions, didn't play with classmates during recess, and spent break time sitting alone in a corner of the covered playground. Even more worrying, Marcia had noticed that Peter was visibly losing weight, and that in the previous week's physical education class he almost fainted. The physical education teacher had warned about this. Marcia asked Yvonne if everything was all right at home, if there had been any significant changes in the boy's routine or diet. Yvonne hesitated. Part of her wanted to pour everything out right there, tell about Patricia, about the veiled abuses, about how the children were suffering. But another part was afraid of being disbelieved, afraid of losing her job, afraid of making the situation even worse. She decided to be cautious. She merely said that Robert had recently started a relationship, that there was a new woman in the house, and that the children were going through a difficult period of adaptation. Marcia understood between the lines that there was something deeper there. She said she would monitor the situation closely and that, if necessary, she would request a meeting with Robert. Yvonne thanked her, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was good to know that someone else was paying attention, but at the same time she feared that any external intervention could provoke an even more violent reaction from Patricia. Clara also began to show alarming changes in the school environment. She had always been a sociable and communicative girl, but now she avoided interacting with her classmates. She spent recess reading alone or just sitting, watching the other children play. Her grades, previously always high, began to drop. She failed to hand in assignments, made simple mistakes on tests, and seemed constantly distracted and disconnected. The English teacher, noticing these changes, spoke with Marcia. Together they decided that action was necessary. They couldn't simply watch two children deteriorating before them without doing anything. Marcia called Robert and scheduled a meeting for the following Friday. When Robert received the call from the school, he felt a mixture of concern and irritation. He had an overloaded schedule, and that meeting would mean reorganizing important commitments. But it was about his children, so there was no choice. He confirmed his attendance and hung up, thinking that it was probably just an exaggeration, that the teachers were seeing problems where there was only a natural period of adjustment. Patricia, when she learned of the meeting, reacted in a calculated way. She told Robert that she thought it was important for her to go too, since she was becoming a fundamental part of the family and needed to understand what was happening to be able to help better. Robert found the suggestion pertinent and confirmed with the school that he would bring his partner. Yvonne, when she learned Patricia would be at the meeting, felt a chill down her spine. She knew that woman was a master of manipulation, that she would be able to control the narrative and make everything seem normal. But there was also a small hope that Mrs. Marcia, with her experience and sensitivity, would be able to see through the facade. Friday arrived cloudy and cold. Robert left work early and stopped home to pick up Patricia. She was dressed professionally and seriously, projecting exactly the image she wanted, that of a responsible woman concerned about the children's well-being. In the car during the drive to school, she expertly laid the groundwork. She told Robert that she hoped the teachers weren't the type to always blame the family structure for any difficulties the children had, that it was common for educators to judge non-traditional families, especially when there was a new partner in the father's life, that she had faced this kind of prejudice before in other situations. Robert, who hadn't considered this possibility, began to feel defensive even before arriving at school. The meeting took place in the coordinator's office, a welcoming environment with colorful posters made by students on the walls. Marcia greeted them with a professional smile and invited them to sit. Also present was the educational coordinator, Beatrice Brown, a woman in her 40s with an attentive and welcoming gaze. Marcia began carefully and diplomatically. She said that Peter and Clara were beloved students by everyone at the school, that they had always shown themselves to be intelligent and participatory children. She explained that in recent weeks, however, there had been worrying changes in the behavior of both. She detailed their social isolation, the drop in academic performance, the visible weight loss, especially in Peter. She mentioned the episode where the boy almost fainted during physical education. She said they had spoken with the children separately, trying to understand what was happening, but both clammed up, seeming afraid to speak. Beatrice added that this pattern of behavior was worrying and usually indicated significant emotional stress at home. Robert listened with a tense expression. He felt judged, inadequate, as if they were telling him he was a terrible father. He began to defend himself, saying that he was doing his best, that he worked hard to support the family, that the separation had been difficult for everyone, that perhaps the children were manipulating emotionally to gain attention. That's when Patricia entered the conversation. With a calm and modulated voice, an expression of genuine concern, she wove her version of reality. She said she perfectly understood the educator's apprehension, but that they needed to consider the full context. She explained that she was helping Robert with the children, trying to establish healthy routines and proper discipline. She said that Peter and Clara were constantly testing limits, that they refused to eat at appropriate times as a way to get attention, that they invented excuses not to fulfill responsibilities, that she herself, trying to be a positive presence, faced resistance because the children saw her as a threat to their mother's memory. She spoke about how she was studying child psychology to better deal with the situation, about how she was trying to be patient and understanding. Marcia listened attentively, but something in that speech didn't ring true. There was a calculated coldness behind the warm words. As an experienced educator, she had developed over the years an ability to perceive when adults lied about situations involving children. And her instinct screamed that this woman was not being honest. She decided to be more direct. She asked specifically about the children's eating habits at home, about who prepared meals, about the dynamic during breakfast and dinner. She asked if there were any new dietary restrictions, if Peter was receiving nutritional monitoring because of his weight loss. Robert was embarrassed because he couldn't answer precisely. He realized now, with discomfort, that he hadn't paid enough attention to these details. Patricia answered for him, saying that Yvonne, the housekeeper, prepared the meals, but that the children had become extremely selective and difficult, refusing almost everything. Beatrice then asked the question that would change everything. She asked if she could speak with Yvonne directly, since she was the one who spent the most time with the children during the day and could provide more detailed information about their routine. Robert agreed without much thought. Patricia felt a pang of panic that she didn't let show on her face, but her jaw tensed slightly. The meeting ended with the agreement that Robert would schedule complete medical appointments for both children and that the school would continue to monitor closely. Beatrice said she would call Yvonne in the next few days for an informal chat. Robert and Patricia left the school, and on the way back, he was visibly bothered. Patricia, realizing she needed to act quickly, began to plant seeds of doubt about Yvonne. She said she had noticed that the housekeeper was jealous of her, that she resisted any changes in routine, that she was possessive towards the children. She suggested that perhaps Yvonne was unconsciously sabotaging their efforts, saying negative things to the children, creating conflicts where none existed. Robert, confused and overwhelmed, began to consider that possibility. After all, Yvonne had indeed shown resistance to Patricia from the beginning. Perhaps she was indeed creating problems because she didn't want to lose her central role in the family. He decided he would have a serious conversation with the housekeeper in the coming days. When they arrived home, the children were with Yvonne in the living room watching a cartoon. Peter was lying on the sofa, Clara sitting on the floor hugging a cushion. When they saw their father and Patricia enter together, both visibly tensed, Robert noticed that reaction and felt a pang of pain in his chest. Why? Did his children seem afraid of his partner? He sat between them and spoke softly. He asked how their day had been, if they had done their homework, if they were hungry. The answers came in monosyllables. Cautious. Yes, no it was. Peter kept his eyes fixed on the television, avoiding looking at Patricia. Clara nervously fiddled with the hem of her own blouse. Robert announced that he had spoken with the teachers, that everyone was concerned about them, that it was important for them to eat better and participate more in classes. He said he would schedule appointments with doctors to check if everything was all right. The children merely nodded, showing no emotional reaction. Yvonne observed everything from the kitchen door, her heart heavy. She saw how the little ones were paralyzed by fear, how they couldn't be natural in Patricia's presence. She decided that when Coordinator Beatrice called, she would tell everything. Even knowing the risks, even knowing that Patricia had threatened to destroy her reputation, she could no longer remain silent. That night, after the children went to bed, Robert and Patricia had dinner alone. She had prepared pasta with tomato sauce, served red wine, and created a pleasant atmosphere. During dinner, she subtly continued to work on Robert's perception of Yvonne. She mentioned small details, things she had supposedly observed. She said that Yvonne spoke ill of her to the children when he wasn't around, that she had caught the housekeeper telling the little ones that she, Patricia, was not trustworthy, that she didn't truly like them, that Yvonne was trying to sabotage their relationship because she didn't want to lose control over the family. Each accusation was presented in a reluctant tone, as if Patricia didn't want to cause problems, but felt obliged to be honest. Robert listened to everything with growing irritation directed at Yvonne. He began to convince himself that the housekeeper was indeed being harmful. He decided that the next day he would have that conversation, making it clear that he needed cooperation, not sabotage. Patricia smiled internally, satisfied. She was managing to completely isolate the children, eliminating the only person who still protected them. In the back room, Yvonne couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in the narrow bed, thinking about everything that had happened. The school meeting had been important, but not enough. The teachers were concerned, but still had no concrete proof of anything. And now, with Patricia probably planting lies about her in Robert's mind, her position became increasingly fragile. She thought about calling Mary, the children's mother, and telling her everything. But she didn't have her contact in Canada, and knew Robert would never provide it. She thought about contacting the authorities directly, but without solid evidence. What would she say? That she suspected the children were being emotionally mistreated by their father's girlfriend. Based on what? On perceptions? On subtle behaviors? She needed more. She decided she would start using her phone to record conversations and situations whenever possible. It was risky, perhaps even illegal, but she was desperate. If Patricia discovered her, the consequences would be terrible. But if she did nothing, the consequences for the children would be worse. The weekend arrived, bringing an almost palpable tension. Robert would spend Saturday and Sunday at home, which meant Patricia would have to maintain her facade the entire time. Yvonne worked only half days on Saturdays and had Sundays off, which would leave the children more exposed. On Saturday morning, Robert woke up determined to have that difficult conversation with Yvonne. He called her into the office and closed the door. What happened in the next 20 minutes would definitively change the dynamic of that house. Robert began by saying that he greatly appreciated her work over the years, that she had always been dedicated and trustworthy, but that he needed to talk about some issues that were worrying him. He said that Patricia had mentioned that Yvonne seemed resentful of her presence, that she made negative comments to the children, that she created unnecessary conflicts, that he understood that changes were difficult, but that he needed everyone to work together for the good of the family. That if Yvonne couldn't accept Patricia, it might be best to re-evaluate the work arrangement. Yvonne felt her blood run cold. It was exactly what Patricia had promised to do, turn Robert completely against her. But this time, instead of recoiling intimidated, something in her broke. All the weeks of silence, all the witnessed humiliations, all the children's suffering exploded into desperate courage. She looked Robert in the eyes and said in a firm voice that all of it was a lie, that Patricia was manipulating the situation, turning him against her so she could continue mistreating the children without witnesses. She said the children were scared, that they were being controlled and emotionally abused, that he needed to wake up and see what was happening. She spoke about the episodes she had witnessed, about how Patricia treated the little ones when he wasn't around, about the locked doors, about the denied meals, about the veiled cruelty in every interaction. Her voice trembled with contained emotion, but the words came out clear and direct. Robert listened to everything with an increasingly closed and irritated expression. When Yvonne finished, he remained silent for a few seconds. Then he said, in a harsh voice, that he was disappointed, that he expected more from her, more maturity, more professionalism, that those accusations were serious and unfounded, that Patricia was a respectable person, and he would not accept her reputation being stained by jealousy and resentment. He said he would give Yvonne one more chance, but that if she continued to cause problems, he would have no choice but to dismiss her. That he hoped she would reflect on her behavior and decide if she wanted to continue being part of that family in a constructive way. He asked her to leave. Yvonne left the office with trembling legs and burning eyes. She felt she had lost her last chance to convince him through words. Now only concrete evidence remained. She needed irrefutable proof, something so clear that not even Robert could deny or rationalize. That weekend she remained cautiously silent, performing her duties without any interaction beyond what was strictly necessary. Patricia, feeling she had won another battle, allowed herself to relax a little. She stayed longer in the apartment, more at ease, more proprietary of the space. Robert tried to spend quality time with his children. He took them to the cinema on Saturday afternoon to watch an animation Clara had mentioned wanting to see. During the film, he noticed how Peter ate the popcorn with avidity, as if he were starving. He also noticed how Clara clung to his arm the entire time, as if she feared he would disappear. On the way back home, he tried to talk. He asked if everything was really all right, if there was anything they wanted to tell him. Peter and Clara exchanged quick glances, that silent communication twins sometimes have. But in the end, they just shook their heads and said everything was fine. Robert felt that something was deeply wrong, but he couldn't identify what. The children clearly hid something, but what and why? Could it really be possible that Patricia was doing what Yvonne accused? It seemed so absurd, so out of character for the intelligent and caring woman he knew. On Sunday, Yvonne was off, and Patricia was responsible for the children while Robert worked in his home office, trapped in endless video conferences with international teams. It was a long and tense day. The children spent most of the time locked in their rooms, supposedly doing schoolwork. Patricia periodically went upstairs to check, always with that cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. In the late afternoon, when Robert finally managed to leave the office, he found the children in the living room, watching television in absolute silence. Patricia was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but there was a charged atmosphere he couldn't completely ignore. During dinner, Peter barely touched his food. Robert insisted he eat, worried about the weight loss the teachers had mentioned. Peter took a few mouthfuls but seemed to have difficulty swallowing. Clara ate mechanically, showing no pleasure or interest in the meal. Robert felt a wave of frustration and helplessness. He didn't understand what was happening with his children. He didn't know how to help them. He couldn't reach them emotionally. He looked at Patricia for support, and she returned his gaze with a comprehending expression, as if saying they were in this together, that it was a challenge they would face side by side. That night, after the children went to sleep, Robert and Patricia talked at length. She suggested that perhaps it was time to seek professional psychological help for Peter and Clara. She said it was clear they were dealing with trauma from the separation, with feelings of abandonment by their mother, and that they needed specialized support. Robert agreed that it was a good idea. He decided that on Monday he would contact child psychologists to schedule evaluations. He felt relieved to have a plan of action, to be doing something concrete. He didn't realize that he was, once again, failing to see the real problem that existed right under his nose. On Monday morning, Coordinator Beatrice called Yvonne. The housekeeper was in the laundry room folding clothes when her phone rang. She saw the school's number on the display and felt her heart race. She answered in a tense voice. Beatrice said she would like to talk to her personally, that it could be at the school itself or at a nearby cafe, whatever was more convenient. Yvonne said she could go to the school that afternoon after work. They arranged for 5 o'clock. When Yvonne arrived at the school, the building was emptier and quieter. Beatrice greeted her in the coordination office with a warm smile and hot tea. She said this was an informal conversation, without pressure, just to better understand what was happening with Peter and Clara. And then Yvonne could finally speak. For the first time since everything began, someone truly listened to her, without judgment, without distrust. She told everything in detail, how Patricia had changed since she started spending more time in the apartment, how the children had transformed, how they were treated when Robert was not present, about the threats she herself had received. Beatrice listened with an increasingly serious and concerned expression. As an educator and coordinator, she had dealt with similar cases before. She recognized the classic patterns of emotional abuse and neglect. But she also knew that she would need more than a housekeeper's account to act officially. She asked Yvonne if she had any proof, any records, photos, recordings, messages. Yvonne said she had started writing things down in a notebook, but hadn't yet managed to record anything concrete. Beatrice then guided her on how to proceed. She said it was important to document everything, that if she had the opportunity to record audios or videos without putting herself or the children at greater risk, she should do so. She explained that the school had protocols for suspected child abuse situations and that, if there was sufficient evidence, they would be obligated to contact child protection agencies. But they needed to be careful, because unfounded accusations could make everything worse for the children and expose Yvonne herself to legal problems. Yvonne left that meeting feeling less alone. She had an ally, someone who believed her. She returned home determined to get the necessary evidence, no matter the risk. The next few days were of growing tension. Robert scheduled medical appointments for the twins. Patricia continued her impeccable performance, always attentive. Yvonne remained silent, observing, noting, waiting for the right moment. And then on a Thursday afternoon, the moment arrived. Robert had an emergency meeting and had to rush out, leaving the children with Patricia. Yvonne was on the second floor when she heard agitated voices coming from Peter's room. She picked up her cell phone with trembling hands, activated the recording, and silently approached the slightly ajar door. What she heard, and managed to record in the next 5 minutes would be the evidence that would change everything. Patricia's voice cut through the slightly ajar door like a sharp blade. The tone was completely different from what she used in Robert's presence. It was cold, cutting, loaded with contempt. Yvonne held her phone tightly, making sure the recording was active, and listened to every word with a heavy heart. Patricia told Peter that he was dead weight, that his father was tired of taking care of a useless boy who couldn't even walk properly, that Clara was also a burden, 2 spoiled and manipulative children who only knew how to whine and demand attention. The boy cried softly, trying to defend himself, saying he tried to get better, that he did everything she told him. Patricia's response was even crueler. She said it was no use trying because he would always be disabled, always be less than others, and that no one would ever truly want him. That his own mother had run away because she couldn't bear to look at him. Peter was sobbing now, begging her to stop, saying he would tell his father. Patricia laughed, a chilling laugh that made Yvonne's blood run cold. She said his father would never believe him, that she had already made sure of that Robert trusted her completely and thought his children were problematic, that if he tried to say anything, she would say he was lying to get attention, and he would be punished even more severely. Yvonne continued recording for a few more minutes, capturing threats, humiliations, and Peter's desperate crying. When Patricia finally left the room, slamming the door, Yvonne quickly hid in the hallway bathroom. She waited for Patricia to go downstairs before entering the boys' room. Peter was curled up in bed, hugging his pillow, crying with his face buried in the fabric to muffle the sound. Yvonne approached slowly and sat on the edge of the bed. She gently touched his shoulder, and the boy turned, startled. When he saw it was her, he threw himself into her arms and cried openly, letting out all the pain, all the fear, all the accumulated despair. Yvonne hugged him tightly, stroked his hair, murmured words of comfort. She said everything would be all right, that she would protect him, that she wouldn't let anything bad happen again. Peter asked between sobs if she truly promised, if his father would finally believe them. Yvonne promised yes, that this time it would be different. She spent the next 20 minutes talking with Peter, making him feel safe enough to speak. The boy told everything, how Patricia prevented them from eating, saying they were fat and lazy, how she locked them in their rooms for hours as punishment for any minor thing, how she forced them to stand still when they made mistakes, how she constantly mocked Peter's physical difficulties and Clara's tears. He also told about the threats, how Patricia said that if they told their father, no one would believe them and they would be sent away to a place where problematic children were locked up, how she assured them that their father was already tired of them, and that any complaint would be the perfect excuse to get rid of them both. Yvonne listened to everything with tears streaming down her face. She didn't record that conversation because it would be too invasive, but she mentally noted every detail. Afterwards, she went to Clara's room and had a similar conversation. The girl, seeing that her brother could finally speak the truth, also opened up completely. When Robert returned home that night, Yvonne was waiting for him. Before he could say anything, she said they needed to talk immediately, that it was urgent and couldn't wait. Robert, seeing the absolute seriousness in her expression, agreed. In the office, with the door closed, Yvonne showed him her phone. She said she had a recording he needed to hear, that it would change everything. Robert hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of listening to something secretly recorded, but Yvonne insisted so vehemently that he finally agreed. She played the audio. The next 5 minutes were the most painful of Robert's life. Hearing Patricia's voice saying those horrible things to his son, hearing Peter crying desperately, hearing the threats and humiliations was like being repeatedly punched in the stomach. He felt physically ill. When the recording ended, he remained in absolute silence for long seconds. Then he abruptly stood up and went straight to Peter's room. The boy was lying down, pretending to be asleep. Robert turned on the light and sat on the bed. In a choked voice, he asked Peter to look at him. He held his son's face in his hands and, with tears in his eyes, asked for forgiveness. He asked forgiveness for not believing, for not seeing, for letting that happen. He said he had been blind, that he had failed as a father, but that now he knew the truth and that everything would change immediately. Peter threw himself into his father's arms and cried as he hadn't cried in months, a cry of relief and liberation. Robert then went to Clara's room and repeated the scene. He hugged his daughter, asked for forgiveness, promised that he would never let anyone hurt her again. Clara held her father's face with her little hands and asked if Patricia was leaving forever. Robert promised yes. He went downstairs with a determination Yvonne had never seen before. Patricia was in the living room reading a book, completely oblivious to what was happening. When Robert entered, she smiled and began to comment on the dinner she had planned. He interrupted her in a harsh, controlled voice. He said he knew everything, that he had proof of what she had been doing to the children, that he wanted her to leave that house immediately and never come back. Patricia paled but quickly tried to compose herself. She denied everything, said she didn't know what he was talking about, that it must be some misunderstanding created by Yvonne. Robert then played the recording at maximum volume. Patricia's own voice echoed through the room, cruel and undeniable. She tried to argue that it was out of context, that it was just a moment of stress, that he didn't understand the pressure of dealing with difficult children. But Robert didn't want to hear. He said she had 20 minutes to gather her things and leave, or he would call the police. Patricia then changed completely. The mask fell away entirely. She said he would regret it, that she knew important people, that she would do everything to destroy his reputation. She threatened to sue for defamation, for illegal recording, for everything she could invent. She blamed Yvonne for ruining their relationship, called the children liars and manipulators. Robert remained firm. He said that if she tried anything, he would take the recordings to the authorities and ensure everyone knew what she was capable of, that he had contacts too, and that he would protect his children in any way necessary. Patricia, seeing that she had completely lost control of the situation, gathered her things with contained fury and slammed the door shut. That night Robert didn't sleep. He sat between his children's beds, which he had moved into the same room so they wouldn't be alone, and watch them sleep. For the first time in weeks, he saw the children relaxed, breathing peacefully, with no apparent nightmares. He felt an overwhelming guilt for everything he had allowed to happen, but also an iron determination to fix things. The next morning he called Coordinator Beatrice and told her everything. She said the school would activate protection protocols, but that she was glad the situation had been resolved internally before reaching more serious instances. She offered psychological support through the school and recommended specialized professionals in child trauma. Robert scheduled emergency appointments with a renowned child psychologist. He also took Peter to the pediatrician for a complete evaluation. The doctor confirmed mild malnutrition and signs of chronic stress, but said that with proper care, recovery would be complete. He prescribed vitamin supplements and nutritional monitoring. The following days were of slow but consistent reconstruction. Robert completely reorganized his professional routine. He spoke with his superiors and managed to reduce travel, work more from home, and have more flexible hours. He decided that his career was worth nothing if he lost his children in the process. Yvonne officially became not just an employee, but an essential part of that family's recovery. Robert publicly acknowledged that she had saved the children, that without her courage and persistence, everything could have ended much worse. He significantly increased her salary and began to treat her with the respect and gratitude she had always deserved. The children began intensive therapy. In the first sessions, they could barely talk about what they had been through. But little by little, with the support of the psychologist and the security of knowing they were protected, they began to open up. They talked about the constant fear, about the nights crying alone, about how they thought no one would believe them. Peter returned to physical therapy with renewed enthusiasm. Without the weight of emotional abuse, his body responded better to the exercises. In a few weeks, he could already walk longer distances with crutches. In 2 months, he was experimenting with walking with just a cane. The physical therapist said the improvement was remarkable, that emotional state truly affected physical recovery. Clara started smiling again. First, they were timid smiles, then restrained giggles, until one day Robert heard her burst out laughing, watching a cartoon with her brother. It was one of the most beautiful sounds he had ever heard. The girl started drawing again, playing, inviting friends to come to the apartment. Mrs. Marcia commented that it was like watching a flower bloom again. Robert maintained limited but cordial contact with Mary. He briefly told her what had happened, without going into details that might make her feel too guilty. She was horrified and wanted to return to the UK immediately, but Robert said the children needed stability now, not more drastic changes. They agreed that she would visit them during the holidays, gradually rebuilding their relationship. Patricia tried to make contact several times, calls, messages, even a letter delivered by a lawyer threatening lawsuits. Robert blocked all communication channels and responded through his own lawyer that any additional attempt at contact would be considered harassment. She eventually gave up, realizing she had completely lost that battle. 3 months later, the family had a completely new and healthy routine. Breakfast all together, with Robert leaving later for work. Shared dinners every night, where they talked about the day, about school, about feelings. Weekends dedicated to family activities, parks, museums, cinema, or simply staying home playing the board games Clara loved. Yvonne, now truly treated as part of the family, had her own stories to tell during dinners. Robert listened to her with real attention, interested in getting to know the woman who had always been there, but whom he had never truly seen. He discovered that she had 3 adult children who lived in the countryside, that she loved traditional folk music, that she dreamed of returning to Cornwall when she retired. On a special Saturday in February, 6 months after Patricia had left that house, Peter managed to walk across the entire living room without any support. They were slow and careful steps, but they were completely independent steps. Robert and Clara erupted in applause and shouts of joy. Yvonne cried with emotion. Peter, in the middle of the room, opened his arms in a triumphant gesture and smiled radiantly. In that moment, Robert realized that they had truly overcome the darkness. His family was broken, yes, but it was being rebuilt on more solid foundations. Foundations of truth, of open communication, of love, demonstrated not only in words, but in consistent actions. He learned that being a father was not just about providing financially or being physically present. It was about being emotionally available, about truly listening, about believing in his children when they tried to ask for help. He learned that blindly trusting someone new, even if that person seemed perfect, was dangerous when vulnerable children were involved. Yvonne also learned something important, that her voice had value, that her perception mattered, that courage is not always loud and dramatic. Sometimes courage is persisting when everyone doubts you. It's protecting those in need, even when risking everything you have. It's believing in your own perception, when the whole world tells you that you are wrong. Peter and Clara learned that their voices mattered, that they had the right to speak when something was wrong, that fear could be overcome with support. They learned that not all adults were trustworthy, but some were, and that it was worth seeking help even when it seemed impossible. The house that once harbored heavy silences and unspoken fears now resonated with conversations, laughter, and music. The apartment remained the same, in the same elegant building in Kensington, but the atmosphere was completely different. It was a true home, imperfect but genuine, wounded but healing. Robert looked at his children and saw no longer frightened and withdrawn children, but a boy and a girl rediscovering joy, confidence, and hope. He saw Clara drawing colorful stories where brave princesses saved themselves. He saw Peter growing stronger every day, more secure, more independent in his movements and in his voice. And when he looked at Yvonne, he no longer saw the invisible housekeeper who had always been there, but the silent warrior who had saved his family when he himself was too blind to see. He saw the woman of strength who taught them all the true meaning of courage and dedication. In that home rebuilt by love, truth, and the courage to face darkness, everyone learned that families are not perfect, but with honesty, true listening, and a willingness to fight for what truly matters, they can be healed. And sometimes, healing is even more beautiful than perfection could ever be. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Robert, Peter, Clara, and Yvonne has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of courage, protection, and family rebuilding, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Every Today we bring intense stories like this, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, showing that even in the most difficult situations, there is always hope when someone has the courage to fight for what is right. We await you in the next episode with a new story that will stir your emotions.